Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Welcome back to LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture for readers and writers to discover and rediscover. We're grateful to our partners for this evening's program, the Rodgers and Hammerstein Organization, NYU Skirball Center, the Kurt Weill Foundation, PBS Great Performances, BroadwayWorld, the Hampton Library, and WNET Group's All Arts Channel. A special welcome to Library of America's fellows and members who support our mission. Recent productions of Oklahoma, South Pacific, My Fair Lady, Fiddler on the Roof, and soon, we hope, Company, are reassessing and updating these great Golden Age Broadway musicals to reflect contemporary aspirations for American society. Do these reimaginings depart from or restore their original meaning and spirit? Are they different from previous revivals? And how to explain the cultural staying power of this American art form? Our jumping off point for tonight's conversation is the 2-volume Library of America edition, American Musicals, the complete books and lyrics of 16 Broadway classics, edited by Laurence Maslon, who joins us tonight. American Musicals was published with support from the Mark Kruger Charitable Trust, the Susan and Elihu Rose Foundation, Roger Berlind, the Peter J. Sharp Foundation, the Cole Porter Musical and Literary Trusts, and Mary Rogers Gettle. Volume 1 has been endowed to keep it permanently in print by a gift from Candace Drake Wainwright to the Guardians of American Letters Fund, made in memory of her father, Alfred Drake, who starred in the original Broadway productions of Oklahoma, Kiss Me Kate, Kismet, and Gigi. Here now to discuss the past, present, and future of the classic American musical, we're incredibly fortunate to have a distinguished panel. Ted Chapin is president of the Rodgers and Hammerstein Organization. His book, Everything Was Possible, The Birth of the Musical Follies, won an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award and a special jury prize for distinguished achievement by the Theater Library Association. He is past chairman of the American Theater Wing and active as a producer and commentator. Tazewell Thompson has directed many operas and musicals, including Porgy and Bess for New York City Opera, and Maxwell Anderson and Kurt Weill's Lost in the Stars for Glimmerglass Opera. His work as playwright includes the musical Jubilee, about the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and most recently, the libretto for the opera Blue on the subject of police brutality, which he also directed for Glimmerglass. Larry Maslon is arts professor at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts graduate acting program. He is host and producer of the radio series Broadway to Main Street on the NPR affiliate WLIW-FM, Long Island's only NPR station, for which he won the 2019 ASCAP Foundation Deems Taylor Award for radio broadcast. His most recent book is the 3rd edition of Broadway, the American Musical, the companion to the Emmy Award-winning PBS series he co-wrote. He is also writer and co-producer of the PBS American Masters documentary, Sammy Davis Jr., I've Gotta Be Me. For the Library of America series, in addition to American musicals, Larry has edited the Broadway comedies of George S. Kaufman and his collaborators. The panelists will talk for about 30 minutes, then invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome Ted Chapin, Larry Maslon, and Tazewell Thompson.
Hey, thanks so much, Max, and thanks for Library of America for hosting this idea. Tazewell should be joining us shortly. Busy guy, so I hope he'll grab on the digital window. We three are friends and colleagues. We're kind of Venn diagram. I've worked with Ted on innumerable projects over the last few decades. I've worked with Tazewell on a number of projects for 30 years. At NYU and Arena Stage, and Ted and Tazewell also serve on the board of trustees of the Kurt Weill Foundation. And the three of us form that union in the Venn diagram because we all worked together in 2019 on an evening about Sammy Davis Jr. at the 92nd Street Y. So I hope you'll enjoy our friendly conversation today. The title of today's conversation is It's a New World, Golde, which all of you theater fans will remember as Tevye's ambivalently wistful comment in the second act of Fiddler, that things are changing, tradition is evolving. And I think that's what we're gonna talk about today. So let me just sort of frame this a little bit. One of the reasons I'm so glad Library of America devoted 2 volumes to American musicals, 16 of them in all, is that American musicals are in many ways one of the most culturally compact and dense signifiers of American culture. You obviously have source material, you have text, you have dialogue, you have plot, but you also have music, you have choreography, you have performers, you have producers, all of whom evolve and change the form, and you also have bodies in space, often of different genders and different races currently than the original creators intended. So I guess I'll toss this to Ted. I mean, do you think that's true, or am I just being kind of highfalutin and semiotic here, saying how many things culturally musicals carry forward from their inception throughout their performance history?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I also think people talk about the golden age of American musicals, and I think one of the interesting aspects about the golden age is that I don't think anybody who was involved with it thought of it that way. I think they just wrote shows, and also it was an era where shows didn't run on Broadway for 15 years. You know, so once you opened, if you were a writer or creator of a musical, once you opened, you just went back and found another idea and tried to go in, you know, and to do the next one. Certainly Rodgers and Hammerstein did that, but, you know, Lerner and Lowe and the Gershwins, God knows. So I think you know, we have the luxury of now looking back at that period and not only seeing which shows stand the test of time, but which themes were obvious then and which were not obvious then. Some of which have proven to be problematic today, some of which have proven to make them even more relevant.
So again, to be a little didactic, you might say that the final collaborator is always the public at the current moment. They're the ones who are going to be absorbing what you're putting out, and good, bad, or indifferent, saying, yes, this revival works, this revival doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you, because this is pretty much your bailiwick as one of our guests today. So if someone says, golly gee, I think Oklahoma, which is, you know, the most relevant, most recent revival, deserves another shot in what we call a first-class presentation, which would be Broadway or a national tour, what do they have to submit to, in your case, the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate, because the living heirs or the living creators are no longer around to make those decisions? I'm sure the process is different each time, but maybe you could give us a quick little,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. It's I mean, I've always felt, and because I've now, you know, been at RNH for many years, you know, it's always a conversation, and you know, somebody will have an idea that sounds intriguing, or they'll have an idea that sounds wrong-minded. And I think it's fair to say the longer I've been there, the more I feel as if the bad ideas are pretty easy to identify and to discourage. I mean, one of the interesting things, as you know, certainly the Oklahoma that was on Broadway last year was never intended for Broadway. It was the request came in to do it in a summer thing at Bard College. And it seemed like an interesting enough idea that, you know, we said, sure, do it at Bard, which they did in 2015. And then it just sort of took one step at a time. After Bard, the next notion was to do it at St. Anne's Warehouse in Brooklyn. And they didn't have any Broadway rights when they went there. But it went well enough there that then the Circle in the Square Theater opened up, and then the request came in, can we move it there? And so that all happened. And I see we have Tazewell.
Welcome,
yes,
Taz.
I was in and then I was out, and I've been having lots of Wi-Fi problems in my apartment, so I apologize. And Larry was sending me messages. I heard everything, but I couldn't see anything. You couldn't see me. So
Okay.
my apologies, everyone. I don't want to reinforce the stereotype that I'm late.
But you
I
heard
was
the nice,
on time.
you heard the nice things we said about you, I hope.
I did. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, yes,
So
So
you
good to see you, Larry, and you, Ted, my
Yeah.
colleague. Friends.
yes.
So let me just have you, Taz, pick up the other sort of close parentheses of that question, as it were. You're a creator. You listen to music, you read plays, and as a director, you say, huh, this material appeals to me. It's 50, 60, 70 years old. How do you rethink these classic musicals, or just what's your creative process? How do you go, huh, maybe there's another way of doing this that appeals to people? Or do you just sometimes deal with the way it was presented originally in its original context?
Well, I haven't had the opportunity to revisit those great classics of the golden era of Broadway. I love them, and I desperately want to do them, and I enjoy watching them on film or in revivals. I missed the recent Oklahoma, which I was out of town the entire run, and I really lament missing that because I heard it was so fascinating. When something comes to me to consider, I want to know everything about it. I want to read everything about it. Part of my process is I want to read the history of it. I want to know about the composers. I want to know about the lyricists. I want to know all the backstage stories of what happened out of town. I want to know the gossip. I want to know the infighting. I want to know how it was scenes were rewritten and who decided to put a dance number in a certain place and then take it away and then open it up with Act 2 with just a dance. I want to know everything. I want to listen to the original cast albums. And I love, to me, the thing that appeals to me about Broadway musicals or any musicals are two things, just superficially, and it's not really superficial. I love the lyrics. I'm a huge fan of Cole Porter, anything that Cole Porter writes, anything. I love the magic of his words, his internal rhyme schemes, the way his head was working. And I love Rodgers and Hart for the same reason. And then I love dance. If I had to live another life and I had the talent, I would be a dancer. I would be a ballet dancer, a tap dancer, or anybody in the chorus. I love anything goes for that reason, for all the musical numbers. I remember Patti LuPone, and was it Sutton Foster in the revival?
Mm-hmm.
Love that. And then I saw a wonderful
revival, yes.
And I saw a wonderful revival of it at Arena Stage. So those things at the top, where the book, the lyrics, how the song works, but then the heart. What is the heart of the musical? What is it about? What is it about? Not the spine and the scaffold and the blueprints are all laid out so beautifully there in terms of its storyline, but the heart of it. Whose heart is broken? Where are the conflicts? What are the relationships? Is it a family and then someone has to leave the family for a better life, or there's internal strife in the family? Whatever it is, it's what is that heart? What's going to compel me to say, I really have to do this because I just love what it has to say and that it strikes me emotionally.
Interesting. I think one of the things, to sort of jump off of what Ted said, Broadway is a commercial business. These things live on and they have afterlives and they've penetrated the worldwide consciousness, but they're started out as commercial constructs. And I'm always struck, as someone who loves them deeply, is this relationship of content and context, or to put it another way, many of these musicals were timely when they came out, and sort of like Cinderella's fairy godmother waved a wand, and then they became timeless. So some musicals managed to make that transition. The way we think of Hamlet or the way we think of A Doll's House, we would never think of changing the way they were written. We think of restaging them in certain ways. So I'm sort of curious, if you guys have thoughts about why musicals, to use a word our dear friend Zelda Fitzhandler would have used, why they're potchkied around with in a way as revivals that opera isn't done that way, and certainly the great classics of Western drama aren't done that way. Why do we feel that there's a get out of jail free card to mess with them, or do we?
Well, I'll grab that with the sort of prime example in my experience, which is The Sound of Music. Since everybody loves the movie, and for many years, every major production wanted to put the movie on stage, or as much of the movie as they possibly could. And I will say that I think the changes made from the stage production to the movie in that particular instance are brilliant. They make for a brilliant movie. But the fact that it took Jack O'Brien 3 years ago to do a touring production of The Sound of Music, in which he actually kept to the script as The Sound of Music opened in 1959 on Broadway, and it proved to be a revelation. He also directed it really well. But in a way, that's a lot of what my job has been, trying to, try to encourage people to do it the way that they, in this case, do the original, and not try to put in "I have confidence in me," which goes all over Salzburg, and you can't go all over Salzburg on stage. But it's so. I mean, every producer has an angle to what they want their production to be, and that they think will be successful, and it's a tug and back and forth.
I think too that probably there is this freedom in frame and in quotes here, or potchkey around with it, is I hear, for instance, Oklahoma did such wonderful, inventive things with that musical. I think that musicals lend itself to that because you don't want to bring a museum piece to the stage. It's a live art form, and you have different stars in different roles. You could have, for instance, a West Side Story that is Black and Caucasians, or as written, Latinos and Caucasians. So there's that premise that can change automatically. And, all those dances that Jerome Robbins so brilliantly choreographed originally, they don't have to be that. In fact, they shouldn't be that anymore. I don't know whether there's a contract. I don't know whether true or not, where you have to do his choreography. But, there's a new movie coming out, and it's Justin Peck, who's a brilliant choreographer, and he did incredible things with, for instance, Carousel, that was on Broadway. So I think there is that opportunity, because the music, you can take the dance music, for instance, and you can extend it, or you could abbreviate it, because you're thinking, the stagehands are going to be paid overtime if we don't bring down the curtain at a certain time.
Right.
Or you can't afford to have a full chorus of dancers who come in pajama game to just dance, and then they're off stage while everybody else is singing something. So I think it has the opportunity to be inventive and to try things. I like that, the opportunity in a musical, that you can Chotsky or Potsky it up, or, but still hold on to that original emotional thread, that you don't lose the intention of what the story is. I welcome it, and I think to just crack it open so that you are not putting whatever that original production was when it first opened in the 40s or 50s on stage, that you're thinking of today's audience. You're thinking of the demographics of today's audience. You're thinking of the demographics to be involved in the production itself. That a certain musical work that would never, ever have considered casting a person of color when it first premiered, now does that freely. I remember seeing a Carousel again at Lincoln Center, and I seem to remember it opened and they were at the the press. They were doing something with
At the Mill, yeah.
at the Mill, and it was a brilliant opening, and that was not in the original.
No.
At least I don't think so.
No.
And there were other things, inventive things like that along the way. And
let me follow up with you used a great word, which is sort of the bridge to where I want to get to next. Intention, which I also derive intent, right? So you have the intent of some very wonderful and in some cases quite progressive writers. Oscar Hammerstein, Yip Harburg, I think were among the most progressive. I guess on the other side of the fence, there might be Cole Porter, even Sondheim, I would argue, who are more interested in things other than what's happening today. But the American musical seems to be somewhat yoked or burdened, from my perspective, with issues of class, race, gender roles that make certain revivals of certain material that would have seemed progressive in 1927 or 1947 seem almost retrograde now. And I know, Taz, you and I had a really interesting discussion once with my class about Showboat and Porgy and Bess. And you actually fell on one side of the fence that kind of surprised me. I was wondering if you mind
I don't
about
remember what I said. I'll try to. I went away, but I see that there are visuals. Well, Porgy and Bess, let me start with that. I was introduced to Porgy and Bess because when I was living with my grandmother, it was coming on television, $1 Million Movie or something like that. And she got up from the sofa and she turned it off. Says, we are not going to watch this. And of course, you know, it piqued my interest. I had to one day find out why. And eventually I did see it in one of the art houses, movie theaters that are no longer existent in New York City, but they were everywhere. And I think I saw it at the Metro. And I loved it. I loved, first of all, seeing this cinerama of, you know, fabulously talented Black performers on the screen. And further, as I, you know, and they were, you know, singing and dancing and loving and fighting, and they had their own world. And then later on, when I got to know more about Porgy and Bess, and I directed it in South Africa and at Glimmerglass and in New York City, and then I directed for television, PBS. What I loved about Porgy and Bess is that here was this community, and it was lived in and run by and worked in and loved in and fought in, all by the same group of culture of people. It was theirs. Now, maybe it was theirs because they weren't allowed to live anyplace else, but still it was theirs. And they made a wonderful life for themselves. And as in any community or neighborhood or culture, there are going to be those, you know, those reprobates, and there's going to be problems. And yes, there's drinking and gambling, and there's a prostitute, and there's happy dust. But that's part of the life. And then you have the young couple whose names I can't remember now, Jake and who opens the opera. Is it Mariah? No, whatever, Summertime. And the score is magnificent. Every single song is great. And, but when I turned to Showboat, and I have to say, I saw a fabulous production of it that Hal Prince directed in New York. I think maybe it was the Minskoff Theater. And I remember reading about it, and it had a lot of trouble out of town in terms of there were protests and pickets. And I think it was in Canada first, and it opened up a new theater. I seem to remember reading about that. But the problem I have with Showboat is that it is not this world where it's all contained with African Americans, Black people. It's Black people at the permission of this white culture. It's Black people who are subjugated in this world. It's Black people who are toting bars, toting bales,
lifting bales, yeah.
Bales, whatever. And I remember there's a song that Queenie sings, and it's, you know, my man is shiftless, my man's good for nothing, So it's one knocked down after another of these characters. And then the lead character, Caucasian woman in it, she does this dance and she mimics the song that Queenie does, and she's expanding on the stereotype of how they sing and how they shuffle and all. It drives me crazy. But I will say, Hal Prince brought me into that world, which we were just talking about in terms of his point of view and inventiveness. And maybe he was getting a lot of, I don't know, criticism out of town and they fix it. I don't know that. But that's the difference. And Porgy and Bess has been a great launching pad for hundreds of singers in the opera world and musical theater world. And Showboat, of course, had Paul Robeson and that song, Old Man River, as brilliantly as he sung that song. And he was a man who was a star athlete and a brilliant scholar, valedictorian of his class. I think it was Columbia or Rutgers or both. And he was this magnificent concertist, but he was stuck with Old Man River for the rest of his life. So it's that, and I'm torn, but I fall on the side of Porgy and Bess.
And I would certainly say, in a way, it falls right into the comment that you made. You know, in 1927, in the land of operetta and the land of musical theater meaning nothing and having, you know, a lot of people going off, you know, onto the mountains of Canada or whatever. You know, here were real Black characters in a show that were treated seriously. However, to Tazewell's point, you know, the way they are written and depicted, they are very much visitors in a white world. Right. I mean, I always find it fascinating that in some ways they're the two smartest people on the stage. I mean, Old Man River may have been a curse to Robeson, but that's a song that, I mean, I've not seen a production of Showboat where the audience doesn't demand an encore of Old Man River.
Yeah,
it's powerful.
It's a great song,
so, yeah. But in this day and age, to your point, I mean, 7 years later, Porgy and Bess, and it was a completely Black world. So Showboat it is a problem. But yeah, no, Garth Drabinsky did that production and did, in fact, you're right, open a theater in Canada, and there were huge protests until the show opened, because I think the concept of what the show was a lot worse for the protesters in Toronto than the actual show itself.
And I would just
good.
For the historical record, Tazewell's talking about the 1936 film, which does have Irene Dunn. She's starting to do a cakewalk, and it's a very interesting, complicated amalgam of different cultures, and it's sort of, you know, it's kind of a baked Alaska of every nightmare / progressive plus, you know, it's a lot to unpack, that movie.
And she does it brilliantly. Yeah. It's so good. That's why it's so offensive. It's like, whoa, where did she get this?
Right. It's what we would now call cultural appropriation.
Right.
But I just want to mention this, and I just want to pivot to another show, is Robeson often refused to sing the lyrics as Oscar Hammerstein wrote them.
Yes, that's right.
He was supposed to do it on Broadway. He didn't. He did it first in 1928 in London. He changed the lyrics to the point where I have a recording that he did, I think maybe at Carnegie Hall as late as the 30s or perhaps the 40s, where he said, "There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't want to be."
Wow.
So he wrestled with that material throughout his entire performing career.
And didn't it also start with N-words or work on the Mississippi?
That's the way the show starts,
yeah.
Yes. And he refused to sing that in every iteration. So a show that seemed like astonishingly progressive back in 1947 by one of the most clearly left-wing progressive, in a good way, progressive writers was Yip Harburg's Finian's Rainbow. And we're gonna see a shot here. One of the elements of the show is a incredibly racist senator of Mississippi, which is this kind of mystical amalgam of every racist Southern Jim Crow state, is turned by a leprechaun into a black-skinned man. So he has to live
as his punishment.
As his punishment to see what it's like. And, you know, wow, what an idea. it would certainly the Leprechaun would certainly find a lot of people to do that to tonight and tomorrow night on television. But be that as it may, you saw the revival where that character was first played by a white character and then played by a white actor and then a black actor. I'm wondering if there are some shows like Finian's that just have simply played out. The octane has run out of their tank in terms of how we can look at these things. They have such dense things about gender. I know, for instance, Billy Bigelow and Carousel and the domestic abuse that's given to that character is brought up a lot. I find that complicated because people don't seem to mind watching revivals of Richard III where he kills 7 people on stage, but Billy Bigelow somehow seems to cross a line. So I'm just wondering if there are shows you think should just, well, I want to specific shows, but do you think that there's a kind of warp and woof of how we live through life where we just want to retire certain things for a while? We want to, like Avalon, we want to send them away, and when they're needed, we'll call for them again. I mean, Ted, you must get requests to do things that seem utterly impossible, like Mr. President or whatever.
Well, I'll go back to Carousel. I'll leave Mr. President at the side for the moment. I, of course, saw it out of town as a kid and thought it was the best musical ever written. But there's a lot of discussion about Carousel these days because it is. I mean, he hits his wife once and pays for it. And some people just don't want any part of it, the entire show, because of that. Other people, I think, have ways of blending that flaw in his character into the other flaws in his character, of which he has many. And I think there's an argument that part of what Carousel is about is that how much you pay for your mistakes, because he pays big time for his mistakes, and then he's enough of a moron that he is given an opportunity to right the wrongs, and he doesn't. He can't do it. So, is that an unlikable character that we should just put on the shelf and not deal with for a number of years? Possibly. I've seen some productions. The production that Tazewell was talking about, that was a production that was so theatrically brilliant. And, as Tazewell pointed out, the director listened to those first brooding chords of the Carousel waltz and said, "They don't tell me I'm in a carnival," which is where that whole pantomime takes place. And he called me one day and said, I was struggling with it. And then he called one day and he said, she works at a mill. It's drudgery. Later on in the story, it's referenced. And he said, that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to see her, those chords, that music tells me of the drudgery of the daily work that these ladies, do in the mill. And again, it's a rather brilliant stroke because no, it's not in the Carousel original script and score, but it is a brilliant director looking at that and pulling something and finding something that was new and different, but was entirely appropriate to what the situation was.
And I think that's really important to point out that when music is good in a musical, as these 16 musicals are, they're in print, of course, that music is a storyteller too. It's not just the words tell every part of the story. You can be influenced in that way. And this leads to my last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Max, who will turn it over to the incredibly impressive number of people who tuned in. So thank you for that. Right. So I am also the literary executor of the Georges Kaufman estate. And the first volume I did for Library of America included Of Thee I Sing, which Kaufman and Riskin wrote with the Gershwin brothers, and it first musical to win the Pulitzer Prize. And every 4 years or so, it's trotted out because it's about a presidential election. And about a year ago, we got a request from a very prominent producer on Broadway that he thought it was so perfect, he wanted to redo it. Could we rewrite the script? We could have a female vice president, we could have a black president, we could do this, we could do that. And then, I sort of took a deep breath because for me, the other issue is often what's changed are they bring somebody in to change the dialogue or cut things. In the Lincoln Center revivals of South Pacific and in well, South Pacific, and in My Fair Lady, that there are textual changes, but you can never change the score.
Sure.
So to me, the question was, okay, let's say I may wave a magic wand and John Oliver rewrites Of Thee I Sing, or somebody like that who's savvy. The Gershwins aren't going to allow one lyric to be changed, nor are they going to allow one note to be changed. And those are songs written for 1931 with a certain kind of innocence of 1931. And if you're going to change the book, I found that kind of problematic, frankly, with the recent My Fair Lady revival at Lincoln Center Theater, that there was so much more of Shaw put back in and such a reframing of the story that the lyrics and the music started to seem a little
superfluous,
naive and superfluous.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm wondering what you guys think about that.
Well, you said it. I completely agree with what you've said. And Of Thee I Sing, which I like that. I love that. Like it a lot. I wouldn't say love. I like it a lot. It's so clever. And you're right. It's of its time. And so I didn't know there was that request of a Black president and a woman vice president, a woman president, which of course, you know, look what's going on now. But you've got to pay attention to what those songs are saying. And the songs are very distinctly about a political situation during that time. And that's the heart and soul of a musical, is the music, are the songs, are those lyrics. And who would want to touch those lyrics? They're brilliant, they're clever, they're funny, they're stinging. And so it's very naive of them. What are you going to do when they start to sing? Where are you? And who's singing it? And who are they singing it to? It wouldn't make any sense at all.
And we actually had a very interesting experience with a Flower Drum Song revival in 2002, because it was a very bold thing. Now, Flower Drum Song is not on the top echelon of Rodgers and Hammerstein shows, but David Henry Hwang had an idea of how to make it more relevant. And I enjoyed the experience. I thought it was a wonderful collaboration. We gave them freedoms that they wanted and I think that they needed. And my wonderful colleague, Bruce Pomahak, when it was all said and done, he said, you know what the problem with that revival was? That's not the score for that production. He should have had a different score written, because ultimately that score was 1958, savvy, it was sort of finger on the pulse, Grant Avenue.
Yep.
What, Larry?
It's a hip show for Flower Drums. You wouldn't think of it that way, but if you were to go back, it's a hip show.
Yeah, exactly.
It is.
Anyway, it's tricky, but we learned a lesson.
All right, we're going to turn this over to Max, who's going to field through.
Right back to you guys. That was terrific, really interesting, and you covered a lot of ground. And there's a lot of questions from people. Many of them go to questions of, how can updates of musicals be more sensitive on both, to communities of all kinds, and on racial and gender issues, but also, honor and respect the work of art. And there's a lot of, so that's the general context of all these questions. But one in particular, Charles Thomas of Arlington, Massachusetts asks, given Lieutenant Cable's song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, and Nellie's transformation, it would seem South Pacific was in the forefront of anti-racial issues and doesn't need an update. Would the panelists agree? And I would just say that same question was asked in different forms by Joan Saltzman of Philadelphia and Lorna Grenadier of Washington, D.C. So what do you say to that?
Well, I'm going to pitch in, having written along with Ted's blessing, the South Pacific Companion book. One of the interesting things that the Lincoln Center Theater production did, and Ted could maybe talk more about it specifically, is there is a song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. There's also an issue that Nellie Forbush goes through when she realizes that Emile de Bec's children are darker, or of a darker race, Polynesian, as it was. In the original Michener, she balks and she uses the N-word. When the show was trying out in Boston, she used the word colored. They're colored, and by the time they got to New York, they changed it to Polynesian, I think.
I think they just cut it entirely.
They just cut it. Yeah. It got gradually denatured from the source material because it was 1949, and frankly, Rodgers and Hammerstein and Michener were thrilled that that you've got to be carefully taught stayed in the production. I mean, when it went on tour in the 50s, it was boycotted by the Georgia State Senate for promoting miscegenation.
No.
So that was a hot show in the McCarthy era, in the post-war era. And when Lincoln Center did it, Bart Sher, the director, did restore some of the original draft dialogue so that we would see from a, what was a 2008 perspective, what they were struggling with, you know, whatever that is, 60 years earlier. Ted,
I think, you know, the point is that, yes, it turns out to be, you know, extraordinarily modern. I mean, when it was Barack Obama delivered his first speech in Philadelphia during previews of South Pacific at Lincoln Center, you know, who would have guessed that suddenly the show had a very modern resonance that nobody could have, you know, foreseen.
And it's extraordinarily relevant. It has no shelf life, no expiration date. That's an extraordinary song when you listen to those lyrics. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. What is going on now with, what is it called, QAnon and the white supremacists, and what's happening in our streets right now? These kids or their parents were taught to behave the way they didn't come out of the womb feeling the way they do by people who are unlike them, who are Black and brown, indigenous people. They were taught to be, and they can't unteach themselves for some reason. It's difficult for them to go past when they see a Black man or a Black boy or a Black person coming towards them in the street who's just going to pass them on the sidewalk. Something happens to them, and that's because they were taught that way.
I also think
Great song.
I also think it's part of Richard Rodgers' genius that he knew the music was not the event of that song. So, you know, he supported I mean, I believe this, he supported the words. He didn't write a Some Enchanted Evening melody for those words. It's just bubbling underneath, like presenting, listen to these words. And also the whole song is like 1 minute and 10 seconds long.
And it's
powerful.
And it's spat out. It's real, it's just charged out there. It's a great moment in the theater.
So to another Rodgers and Hammerstein show, Barbara Ching of Ames, Iowa, asks, how might the recent Supreme Court ruling that declares Eastern Oklahoma, including Claremore, still Indian territory, alter future productions of Oklahoma? And also, I think you could also take that question in a broad, I mean, I think you should try, you know, take that question as it is, but also more broadly, you know, are there events that happen?
I think that's an amazing, I
want to changes in these classic works.
Well, I want to thank her for that question. That's
quite a question. Yeah.
Top of it. You know, Ted and I just collaborated on an essay or two for the Rodgers and Hammerstein website about the history of Oklahoma, and where the show is set is in a very, very kind of hot spot. I mean, it's on the border of what was called Indian territory, except the word Indian and the nations that existed that surround everybody in Oklahoma isn't even mentioned except in the initial stage direction. It says Oklahoma, formerly Indian territory. So we've learned a lot more, and Ted can talk about some various productions across the country. That kind of information, I think, actually uplifts a show that's pretty uplifting anyway. It strips away the patina of maybe you saw it 100 times in summer camp. And it goes back to what they really were writing about, because these values about these pioneers trying to make something for themselves and an identity for themselves is completely, in my opinion, congruent with this particular progressive movement in Oklahoma, which I think is fantastic. But Ted may want to talk about some other things.
Well, I just think that was beautifully stated, and I think you're absolutely right. Now, Lynn Riggs, who wrote Green Grow the Lilacs, the play upon which Oklahoma is based, who was himself part Cherokee and did not deal with the Indians in any way, shape, or form in his play. So Rodgers and Hammerstein took the play and went from there, and it was the thing to do. Obviously he didn't want to deal with that. Larry alluded to some interesting productions. There have been fascinating productions, one of which at Portland Stage in Oregon that was all Black, because in doing the research for the production, Chris Coleman, the director, found that there were many Black communities in Oklahoma. So taking that play and setting the whole thing in an all Black community was very, very powerful. And I just thought it was fun. It was a fun production.
And it's based on research, I think, because of the post-Civil War era in Kansas, neighboring it, and so on and so forth. I think there were something like 85 separate, entirely Black communities in the Indian and Oklahoma territory. So when that group of people sings, "We know we belong to the land," that only enhances the depth and the universality that Rodgers and Hammerstein created.
So one last on kind of the Rodgers and Hammerstein kind of two related questions. Michael Olechik, who's writing from Warsaw, Poland, says it's been a while since an RH musical was made into a movie. If I'm correct, the 1999 TV film of South Pacific was the last. If you had the power, I guess he's asking Ted this question. If you had the power,
money.
Maybe not. If any of you had the power, or all of you together had the power to commission a film version of any of them now, which would you choose, and who would you pick to direct? And there's a related question. Someone asks, are these issues of revivals and faithfulness and updating and relevance different when it comes to live theater versions versus film versions? So it's two questions really relating to film versions.
Well, I'll dive into the film by saying that we actually have concluded a deal with a very interesting film company called Skydance that does television and film to create a multi-episode series based not really on the musical Oklahoma. I mean, it's not going to be the musical Oklahoma spread out over all these things, but it's the idea of taking what's in the essence of the themes and the character names and stuff like that, but creating a modern story that deals with the Native American, the nations, all the things that the show doesn't deal with, but also, you know, coming back home. The Lori character actually lives in New York, but comes home. So that will either be a totally reimagined Oklahoma that will be spectacular, or it'll never get made. You know, at the moment, it is going to get made. So I think that's good. There are remake discussions all the time. Whenever anybody says, what about doing a remake of The Sound of Music? I very simply say, tell me what the first shot is going to be. Just very simply, because we know what the first shot can't be. So what's it going to be? And that tends to stop the conversation pretty quickly.
I think.
And if there were going to be a film of any of the Rodgers and Hammerstein works, would you set it in today's world, or would it be set when the musical was first written, and then why? And you know, that would be the question. Just what you said, Ted. Tell me what the first shot's going to be. Where are we? What's the era? Who are these characters? What do they look like? Then that'll tell us a lot, you know. And I wonder, you know, I grew up for 7 years in a convent surrounded by Dominican nuns. They love the music. And I learned the entire score. We sang it at spring festivals. I mean, I know the entire score.
I think, Max, it sort of begs a question, is like film adaptations of stage musicals, we're all eagerly awaiting West Side Story. And that to me is like, why would you remake West Side Story? Well, if you've got Spielberg and Kushner, give it a shot. But often, like, the film of Cabaret is extremely different from the show of Cabaret. So films allow you to do many, many, many. By necessity, you have to do adaptation. I think the Rodgers and Hammerstein show that would make a fantastic movie and might in fact solve its problem would be Allegro, because it was the first stage musical to be staged cinematically with wipes and dissolves and stuff like that back in 1947. So that would be a great project for the right person.
From your mouth.
Yeah.
We'll have a pool. We'll have a Kickstarter.
Right.
So we'll move off Rodgers and Hammerstein for a moment. Library of America board member Michael Beirut has just written with a question. He says, Sondheim has revised his shows to the point where there isn't really a canonical version of, say, Merrily We Roll Along, not to mention the new gender-switched company. Does this contradict the idea of the score and lyrics of a musical are sacred or fixed in some way, or are the rules different when it's the original author doing the revising?
Whoa.
Did you say both?
I just said, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think that's an issue. I mean, there's a sort of technical issue, which is if you want to do Merrily We Roll Along, I think you can only license the revised version. So yes, of course, they're and by the way, if you feel compelled to buy the 2-volume set of American musicals by Library of America, we have lots of alternative versions that have stood the test of performance history in the back. So in fact, when Cabaret, it's a good example, I can't really talk to Sondheim, who changes his mind frequently, but Cabaret was a show and then a movie which had many new songs by Kander and Ebb, so much so that the subsequent stage revivals would be insane not to interpolate those. So it's a question, I guess it's a canonical question, but at the end of the day, I suppose, and I turn this over to Ted, it's also a licensing question. If you want to revive or do these shows, not everybody gets to do the version that they would love to do in their head. Is that right?
Yeah, but also, I mean, I think one of the astonishing things about Sondheim is that he's living through the reappreciation of all his work. And in a way that I don't think anybody else ever has. I mean, John Kander, yes, because every time Cabaret is done, it's different. But the fact that Sondheim seems so open to all these, reinterpretations, because he's watching people, look at his flops and say, I can put life in Anyone Can Whistle, and it must be astonishing to go through that, to be at his age, and because he says yes to a lot of these things, and good for him, power to him. But it from a textual standpoint, the question, begs like it's he can do this, and and fine, others it's tricky. It's always tricky.
Yeah.
To that point, I was years ago, I was running a theater in Connecticut, Westport Country Playhouse, and Billy Porter approached me and said he had this idea of a Sondheim evening of songs and scenes from Sondheim shows, but he wanted to do it with an all-black cast. And I said, when we talked about it, I said, sounds fine to me. Get permission. Do you have permission from Stephen Sondheim? And he, just as you said, he said, yes, I'd love to see that. And Stephen Sondheim was very involved with, he wanted cast approval. And, there's certain singers that Billy wanted, and Sondheim said, well, maybe not. But he put it together, and Sondheim came up, saw a run through and gave notes, quite lengthy notes. I wasn't privy to those notes. And there were some changes. And he came back again, and he loved it. Loved the whole idea. He was totally open, and he said, he wrote me a lovely note. He says, you know what? Thank you for doing this. I learned a lot. He said, I learned a lot by watching this.
That's great. Okay, two sort of linked questions. You can go for either or both. Allison Budenhagen of New York City asks, which musicals from Broadway's golden age are ripe for rediscovery now by a new generation? So like what's out there to be rediscovered? And then another question from Elizabeth Zook of White Plains, which current musicals do you think will become classic and why? Because you can go for either of those, whichever you want. You can either take the ripe for revival, or what's out there now that has a good bid to become a classic.
Well, I'm going to jump in because I know my colleagues, I think, might back me up. But one of the great things about musicals is that they can be set during the Spanish Inquisition and somehow speak to the era of Martin Luther King, right? Man of La Mancha. And the 60s were weird. They had shows like Fiddler on the Roof, which has nothing to do with America in the 1960s, but everything to do with America in the 1960s because it's about the generation gap. But there's the only show I know of in the 1960s before Hair that had any relevance to the racial, social, cultural dynamism of that era was a musical called Golden Boy, which starred Sammy Davis Jr. as a reimagined Clifford Odets play set in the 1960s. It's got a brilliant score, and it still, no pun intended, packs a punch. And I would love to see that taken up by gifted individuals like Tazewell in the immediate future.
Love to direct it. I love that show. I totally agree with you, Larry. It must admit, well, because we did a show together about Sammy Davis Jr. and you filled me in on all of the backstage stories and the rehearsals and what was working and not working and the furor it caused on Broadway, because here was Sammy Davis Jr. kissing a blonde, white leading lady. And when I revisited the score, it's a fantastic show. It has everything. So I agree with you. It was certainly way ahead of its time when it happened, and it would be so right to do right now. And I would love to direct it somewhere.
But if I can, one little brief side story, that when we did that at the 92nd Street, I remember seeing Golden Boy, and I remember loving the projections. And so I wrote to Richard Bilbrow and said, "Where are the projections?" He said, "I just figured out how to put them on the wall. They were all Tony Walton's." So I wrote to Tony. He sent them all to me. We used some of them. They were spectacular. And he came to a dress rehearsal and leaned over at one point and said, "Can I take a picture?" To which I said, "What, of your designs?" "Yes, I think you can."
Yes.
And they were
brilliant
designs too. Timeless.
I just got a text from the world's greatest lighting designer, one of them anyway, Robert Wurzel, all caps, "Yes, Golden Boy."
Right.
Well, I guess to continue with that, and we only have time for one or two more, but Michael Diamond of Norwalk, Connecticut asks, does Hamilton represent a new direction for the American musical? And will it, or how will it, influence how artists revisit or reinterpret the classics? So I guess that's a question. Is Hamilton, which is such a phenomenon, do you see it affecting, future or current revivals of this classics? And a related question, sort of, from Sharon Newman of Dover, Delaware, what revivals are in the works now? What are the plans for future revivals? So either one of those, what's in the works that you're excited about, looking forward to, and has Hamilton or will Hamilton affect these future revivals of the classics?
Well, I'll say that there's a Pal Joey that's been talked about, but there's a Pal Joey that's been talked about sort of constantly, always. But interestingly, this is a very interesting group of people putting it together, and they've said it. I mean, it's in Chicago at the time period, but there's a very clear African American element to this production, and has been for the last 3 years. So that's an interesting one, and it's
that's not even a new idea. What about Pal Joey 78 with
It's
Lena
been done before, yeah, but it's the gold ring. Pal Joey seems to be the revival gold ring that no one's ever quite been able to grab successfully.
And I think one way
go ahead.
Sorry, one way of twinning that answer is there was, I don't know what's going to happen now, of course, we all miss Broadway terribly, but a revival of 1776, which is a personal favorite to me, that is not only going to have a racially diverse cast, which was done that way in Encores, what, Ted, 5-6 years ago,
right.
Post-Hamilton? Hamilton inspired Encores to do a 1776 that was gingerly, non-traditionally cast. But this is going to be all female and all people of color.
Wow.
And I sort of am excited. I dread it a little bit just because it's my favorite show, but I'm thrilled because one of my former students is playing John Adams, Crystal Lucas Perry. So I think that's this kind of Venn diagram of stuff. And Diane Paulus is going to direct it, who has her fans and her detractors, God knows, but we'll see what that's like. I
remember seeing a show that everybody thought was going to change the course of Broadway musicals, like Hamilton in its time. I saw the third preview of a show called Chorus Line at the Public Theater. And sitting in front of me was Ruth Gordon and Garson Kanin. And at the end of the show, I was knocked out. At the end of the show, we're going up the aisle. And she said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I loved it." "Yeah, me too." She says, "Do you think it has any life?" And I said, "I think so." She said, I'm gonna write Joe a letter, because after all, he gave me these tickets. I didn't have to pay for them. Of course, I would have paid for them, But she says, I think this is going to change the course of Broadway musicals if it goes to Broadway. It can't play forever at this place. I hope not. There you go. Now, Chorus Line, of course, opened and ran forever, but did it change the way that librettists and composers approached musicals? Maybe, maybe not.
That's probably a good place to leave it, actually, with that question. Thank you all. You've been listening to Tazewell Thompson, Ted Chapin, and Larry Maslon discuss the present and future of classic Broadway musicals. Books and lyrics of 16 shows are published by Library of America in 2 volumes, volumes number 253 and 254 in the Library of America series, edited by Larry Maslon. I hope you will join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Thursday, September 10th, it's 13 Days, Abraham Lincoln and the Crisis of Presidential Succession with historian Ted Widmer. On September 24th, we welcome Princeton University's Eddie Glaude Jr., best-selling author of Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, for our 3rd episode of Reading James Baldwin Now. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's American Musicals edition and links to purchase that and other volumes of essential American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Tazewell Thompson, Ted Chapin, and Larry Maslon for an extremely stimulating evening, and have a great evening.